Okay, so I'll go ahead and get us started. So welcome to another exciting week of CSDE's seminar series. Today, we have a very exciting guest from South Africa who's actually here in Seattle giving a talk. To remind you, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A in the chat bar so that at the end of the talk that we can ask these questions. And I'm going to pass it off to Ann Bostrom, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. I'm Ann Bostrom from the Evans School of Public Policy and Governance, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Gina Zeervogel. She's an associate professor in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She holds a PhD in geography from Oxford. Her research focuses on climate change adaptation and development across scales from the household to the municipal level, with a focus on urban water and resilience issues. She has conducted research on a broad range of social and environmental issues in Southern Africa, and is particularly interested in transdisciplinary approaches to address the governance of urban climate adaptation and social justice. Gina serves on the City of Cape Town's Water Resilience Advisory Section 80 Committee. She's an IPCC 6th Assessment Report author on the city's chapter and has published widely. She's currently in the US at the UC Santa Cruz. I'm sorry, this is confusing because she's in Seattle now, but anyway, she's been on a Fulbright for 6 months until this month. Welcome, Gina. We're really pleased to have you speak today.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Peter. It's great to be with you today. So I'm going to start sharing. Great. Good. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of community-generated data for urban resilience, drawing on my South African experience. There we go. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about urban resilience and adapting to climate extremes, and why it's really important, if this is our goal, to draw on multiple perspectives. I'm then going to draw on the work that I've been doing in Cape Town through an AXA-funded project where I've looked at the City of Cape Town's drought and how it's been governed from the city level and from the community level. And as part of that, we'll look at a 7-minute video. And then we'll look at some of the challenges of integrating bottom-up data in city government. So, if we are interested in really trying to strengthen urban resilience, one of the arguments is that we really need to understand the different aspects of the system. And there's no one group that is able to do that fully. We have to draw on these multiple perspectives. We have to understand it at multiple levels, from different worldviews, to understand the complexity of the system and the potential for responding. So part of that is to really draw on different groups. So historically, local governments have been able to provide a lot of the services and develop what's needed to run a well-functioning city. But what we know now is that we have to invest more in collaboration and co-production. Co-production is working together to think about the questions and think about the solutions. And if we do that, and we do that well, it can help to create buy-in from a broader group. It helps to understand the system better, and we can start to see innovation and different ways of thinking about the problem. And just to say that there's been quite a lot of work on this growing, and those of you working in urban systems will be aware of this. I work a lot in the climate adaptation space, where there's a lot of focus on co-production. And it is often a quite resource-intensive approach, but it's really important. And so then today, one of the areas that I really wanted to focus on is community-generated data. And so, of course, we can have co-production of processes that are more process-orientated, but we can also think about what does it mean to collect community-generated data. This is really important because we need to inform the responses from a bottom-up perspective. We need to make sure that the bottom-up perspective is integrated in the types of responses we're developing. And importantly, low-income citizens who often don't have a seat at the table, struggle to get heard, need to have a platform to have their perspectives shared. And if we can start to gather data from different areas, and particularly in low-income areas that are often underserviced, we can start to hear some of those experiences and therefore try and address some of the challenges. I've also worked in the context of social justice and what it means to bring in different voices and try and address inequities that we experience. And part of that can be to actually try and support and integrate community-generated data. So one of the things, one of the areas that I've worked in quite a lot is particularly looking at adapting to urban climate extremes. And what we've seen is that during climate extremes, the city often needs to prioritize its functioning. How is it working? Are all the services working? Yet that often means that they're not listening to the citizens and the experience of the citizens. So during the Cape Town drought, what we saw happen is that there was a real focus on trying to prioritize an increase in water supply and reducing use. But often the inequality issues were sidelined or not considered sufficiently. So Ashley Dawson has written this book a few years ago called Extreme Cities, The Peril and Promise of Urban Life in the Age of Climate Change. And what he's saying is that we are increasingly seeing this focus on extreme events in cities, but also we have extreme inequality in cities. And if we don't look at these two things together, we're going to be caught out. We have to address the inequalities and the access and whose needs are being met more, as well as the extreme events. We also know we're seeing an increasing focus on smart cities, where there is data-driven decision-making that's really important. We see this as important for holding cities accountable. We're trying to understand how we can collect more and more data, but we need to stop and think about what data is captured and who is that data serving, who has thought about the data, and who's it responsible for. I just wanted to quickly pause and check. I know that there's some other people trying to get on and I can't see any more here. Do you think it's fine from your perspective, everybody?
Gina, and there are 35 people attending. So
okay.
It's just the panelists who show in the window.
Thank you. Perfect.
And plus there are people online.
Right. Cool. I just wanted to check that before I continued. So thank you. So the work that I'm going to share today comes from a project that I've been doing over the last 4 years, where I set up a project to look at urban water governance for resilience in the city of Cape Town. And when I started the project, the Cape Town, the big drought hadn't really developed that much. And so as the drought developed, I sort of shifted focus a bit. But essentially what I was looking at was trying to understand different perspectives on water governance at the city level and the local level. What were these different perspectives? How were different groups understanding the challenge and the potential solutions? So part of my objective was to explore how to bring different perspectives together across levels. But as the drought developed, I focused initially actually on what was happening within city government. Yet emerging from the drought, once I'd done a lot of that work, I realized and knew before that that was one part of the story. And so I really wanted to look at more of the bottom-up stories. And for me, what is so important is that the governance of urban natural resources is so central to climate adaptation. So I've worked in the climate change adaptation field for a long time, and the more time I spend working in it, the more I appreciate how important it is to understand how natural resources are governed, how issues of economics, social issues, justice, and ecology are part of the challenge. And so another part, of course, for me, with my focus on social justice, is building capacity to address inequality and injustice as part of transformative climate adaptation. For those of you who are not familiar with the term transformative climate adaptation, I'm using it to mean not just work and responses that we develop that reduce climate risk, but also responses that help address some of the systemic injustices in the system. Transformative adaptation is also often seen as a system-wide issue where you're looking at the system and working with that as a whole rather than just as one part of it. And I'll talk a bit more about that as I go on. So I want to put forward two parts of the story. The one is the work I've done at the city government level, and then later I'll talk a bit more about the work I've done at the local level. So if we look at what happened in the Cape Town drought, I think it's just useful for context for those of you who are not aware to have a sense of what happened. And as you can see at the bottom, the time is along the bottom. And I don't think I've got a cursor here, but what we can see that the dam storage, which is the top line, was kind of up near to 100% in 2014. We can see then in 2015, it got lower to just over 71%. By 2016, it was down to 61%. Of course, we have a Mediterranean climate, and so in our southern hemisphere, December, January time is summer and it's hot, and that's when the usage increases and the dam levels go down. So what we saw in July 2017 was our dams only fill up to 38% that winter. Now, 95% of the city of Cape Town's water comes from 6 dams around the city. So this was really concerning. What we can see in the middle row, though, is what happened with, first of all, the red line is agricultural use. So we see agricultural use go up in the summer months, and we see that in 2016, it went up pretty high. And one of the challenges was that the agricultural restrictions were not being enforced, which some people post sort of drought were very critical about. And then agricultural restrictions were enforced, and we can see in 2018 that the usage in the agricultural system was a lot lower. But what's really quite impressive is that the urban use that was 1,200 megaliters per day in 2015 really reduced dramatically during the 2018 drought years. So we can see that that blue line in 2018 was down just above 500 megaliters per day. So over a 2-year period, the usage of water in the city of Cape Town halved, which was a very significant thing, because it means that there was then more water to go around. And the bottom row, of course, is the rainfall, where we can see that 2016 was fairly low. 2017, when we were hoping for some winter rainfall, was even lower, which was very concerning. But fortunately, in 2018, it rained. And also in 2018, there had been a bit more time to invest in additional water sources. And so the dams were back at 75% by the end of the 2018 winter. I think it's quite useful just to show this to give a sense of how the city was managing restrictions. So in 2016, there was a ban, an initial sort of set of restrictions banning garden hoses, car washing, etc. June 2017, there was a limit of how much water you could use per person per day, 100 liters, and you couldn't use outdoor water that wasn't essential. A month later, they dropped that amount to 87 liters per person per day for households of 4 people and capped it at 10 kiloliters of water per month. Quite soon afterwards, in September, they realized that the approach that they had, the amount that they put forward in July, wasn't actually fair to many of the households where they're low-income families, where there are not 4 people in a house, but there might be multiple families living on one property. And so that 10 kiloliters really was not enough for people to survive on. And so they increased that to 20 kiloliters, recognizing that there were often 8 or more people in a household. By January 2018 was when the international media had started sharing this news about day 0, and day 0 was the day when the city said they would need to turn off the taps of residents. And there would still be some water in the dam, but they wanted to leave that water for emergency supply. So the hospitals would still have water. They would still provide water in the informal settlements. And there would be the business district would have water, but people like myself would have to walk to what they call the pod, a point of distribution, to collect our daily amount of water. Would this really have happened is another story and discussion, but there was a lot of concern about now, would we be able to make it to the winter rains? And so water was restricted to 87 liters and again down to 10 kiloliters per household. And then in February, we were told to use 50 litres per person per day, a very low amount. It meant showering not every day, having a 2-minute shower, using the water from the shower for other purposes. It was a very challenging time to live with such limits on water. But the reality is that there are large numbers of people in our city who are living with limited water every day because they live in a shack made of corrugated iron. They walk to a standpipe to collect water. So essentially, they're living with day zero, which is part of what a lot of the social justice movement tried to highlight after the drought, that there's all this attention on wealthy households and having their access to water. But what about the people who daily live with that limitation? So as part of my work on this, I was asked by the South African National Treasury to do some work looking at the lessons learned on governance. And so I don't have much time to go into all the details of that, but I will share some links to some reports where there are more details for those of you who are interested. But essentially from this work, I pulled out 12 different lessons. And what was interesting to see is that data, expertise, and communication was really one area that was very important, as was strengthening governance, taking a systems approach. And I think the systems approach one is important because there had been historically a focus more on the engineering, technical side of water, because that is what had enabled water to be provided. But we needed to start understanding the social, economic, ecological impacts a lot better. And then the need to build adaptive capacity. So I'm not going to go into all of these 12 lessons that were pulled up, but I just want to focus on the data, expertise, and communication column, because from the city government's perspective, they felt it was important to understand the local water system more, to share information about the water situation, to build public trust, and actively seek external expertise and experience. And then in the far left column at the bottom there is invest in partnerships beyond the city. So what I felt is that there really wasn't enough focus on trying to understand what different residents in the city were experiencing, and particularly how the low-income households were experiencing the drought. What they did focus on was how important it was to have good data. And so during the drought, they realized that there were some gaps in their understanding of dams, water, etc., storage. So that was improved. Initially, it was very hard for citizens to get access to good data. And so that was challenging. But soon they created this dashboard on the top right there, where it made it very easy for citizens to go onto the website, see exactly how much water was being used, the target, how much water was in the dams. And as there was more and more information, then stakeholders could make their own decisions, which was really important. The focus on communication was very much around how to live an 87-litre life, a 100-litre life. How do you change behavior? But unfortunately, there was very little information shared about exactly what the government was doing, because they were concerned and didn't want to be open to criticism because they knew that this was a hot topic. So just to sort of wrap up this section and just sort of talk about some of the products that came out. The Unpacking Drought was sort of a long 20-page document that I put together that was very useful for the city to share with lots of other people around the world who wanted to understand what happened in terms of the governance of the drought. I then had colleagues who did an amazing set of films, and that's the Cape Town Drought Response Learning Initiative at the bottom left. That's really worth going to look at, particularly for students who might want to do research, because 30 different experts were filmed, these beautiful hour-long interviews where you can hear straight after a kind of urban crisis how they had interpreted it and responded to it. I then also sought funding to work with a journalist to write this book, Day Zero, One City's Response to a Record-Breaking Drought. I felt that part of holding cities accountable is making sure citizens know what cities are doing. And it's very hard to hold your local government accountable if you don't know what's happening. So I worked with a journalist and we wrote this book, and it's online. And so please have a look if you want. But it really helps to unpack it in a very accessible way, which I felt was kind of part of my responsibility as an academic who wants to do applied work to share this work more broadly. And then with that went a little sort of 3-minute movie down at the bottom, just to kind of get some of the messages across. And so coming out of the drought, what we saw was the city of Cape Town really learned a lot of lessons. I was very excited as somebody who works in the kind of urban climate adaptation and resilience field to see quite a holistic thinking. The city was engaging in their resilience planning at the same time. So they were bringing a lot of the sort of resilience concepts about a more systemic approach, understanding the interrelation between stresses to the table. And so a really forward-looking new water strategy was presented in 2019. And one of the things I noticed, and I was involved in this to some extent because I was on the city's Water Resilience Advisory Committee, and so I would often push these issues in those meetings, but they committed in this document to talk about collaborative relationships. We can see here they said collaborative relationships are built on trust, and trust is built where there is transparency and mutual accountability, and where stated intentions of all partners are consistently translated into action. They also said the city will endeavor to create an enabling environment in order to be responsive to citizen-led water initiatives, and that comprehensive data collected by the City of Cape Town and by communities combined, enabling better decisions and on interventions in informal settlements. And so as exciting as this is the sort of strategy they've put forward, and they don't necessarily have implementation plans on all of this yet. And so part of what I then took forward was saying, well, let's see what we can do and how we can actually challenge the city to move forward on this. So as part of my work, I really wanted to engage at the local level because my sort of theoretical interest is around multi-level governance between citizens and local government. What are the opportunities for citizens to engage with local government? How is local government engaging with citizens? How do we develop this relationship better so that we can effectively move forward? And there was a lot of critique of the City of Cape Town and their lack of citizen engagement during the drought. As time went by, they did improve in many ways, but it was quite slow. It's often been quite frustrating to get a response from the city. I've worked with many NGOs over the years, and you don't know who to go to in the city. It is a city of 4 million people, so it's pretty big. There are a lot of government officials, but it's hard to see exactly where citizens and local government are collaborating at times. So I engaged in an action research project with the EMG, the Environmental Monitoring Group, which is an NGO that's worked on water and climate issues at the local level for the last 20 years. And there is a group of activist citizens called the Western Cape Water Caucus. That's a community-based organization with residents in low-income areas across Cape Town. And they work very closely with the NGO EMG. And so together we developed an action learning project where as academics, my postdoc and myself were very interested in water issues in low-income areas, trying to understand multi-level governance better and possibilities for strengthening community-generated data. The Water Caucus was interested in collecting better evidence to support their advocacy work. They've been doing a lot of advocacy work over time, but it's often based on their personal experience, and they really wanted to make sure that they had some sort of solid evidence that they could take forward. And part of this was building their internal capacity as an organization that's constantly struggling. People have got different jobs, they're struggling to survive essentially, but these people are very passionate about water in their communities. And so what I want to do now is pause from my talking and show you this wonderful video that is 8 minutes that literally was finished yesterday. We've got a longer 16-minute video, but our filmmaker has done an 8-minute version to tell you a bit about the SenseMaker project. I'll then pick up on that a bit further to sort of share some of the data issues, and we'll then come back to wrapping up. So hopefully this is going to work from here, and hopefully you will see the video. Somebody let me know if you can't.
As basisazi ukubana water is life. Without water, akho nto unoyenza. Kwabonakala okokubana amanzi kufuneka swanekekele kakhulu and ayaphela amanzi eWestern Cape. Kwabonakala ukuthi ulapho kuvele khona ukuba ongathathi ntweni konayo into noko epokothini kuba kaloku
The project is part of a bigger piece of work that I've been doing. I was very interested in addressing issues of adaptation to climate change in cities. And for me, a lot of the adaptation to climate change is experienced through a water lens, both through drought and flooding. I'm also particularly interested in what it means in cities in Southern Africa, and so issues of inequality are very important to address. And of course, people have very unequal access to water services, to resources to adapt to climate extremes.
I got involved in this project because I was interested in the water crisis in Cape Town. I also knew from before getting here that there's a broader story to be told as well, where not everyone is facing the same type of crisis.
So one of the important principles for me when thinking about resilience of cities to climate and water stress is the importance of bringing in multiple voices and understanding the different perspectives and stories of how we might try and respond to the challenges.
The Environmental Monitoring Group, which is based in Cape Town, really its projects are to facilitate a respectable or a respectful relationship between people themselves and the environment. We also believe that power needs to be questioned and distracted so that it responds fairly, not speaking on behalf of communities, but creating spaces where those in power come to communities and the conversation happen.
So basically, the whole process had two steps. The first steps was designing the data collection and then going out and collecting stories. And then the second half of the project was the second workshop, analyzing the data and synthesizing the insights, and then going out and also then sharing the insights and feeding back stories to the communities where we had studied.
Johan and Gina came and we had workshoppings with him. And then we started with a sense maker. They educate us around that. And we had classes at Stellenbosch University.
One of the things that came out of the Water Caucus was that they wanted to learn tools to document their experience, because they have stories to tell of their own experience, but they haven't necessarily been trained in research or collecting data. And so they saw that as something important.
It was a learning process. And yeah, there was also painful moments, because when you go out there to do the research and you see the problems of the people.
ezokokubana uyuthetha nomuntu uyumcacisela okokubana njengolapha emakhaya uyandazi mos nam ndinale meter box unayo ithini wena eyakho into atsho umuntu avule isifuba sakhe kuba ubona uba umuntu ebexakwe yindawo anothathethe kuyo.
It was not Stellenbosch or UCT sharing its findings with the officials. It was ordinary people that had been doing the research on the ground and sharing their findings with the officials. Officials begin to realize that people can be able to do this, and then they are presenting something with facts, tested data on the ground. They are presenting to us. Therefore, I think their perception about community, I think it has changed.
The city says, yes, we want to engage with NGOs and citizens, but how do we engage one-on-one? So if NGOs can come with data that is what they see as robust, then they are likely to be interested. And we saw that that was the case. So at the end of SenseMaker, the city officials who were present at that workshop were really interested in this data.
I think our team from the city were so impressed by the way that ordinary people had presented so professionally the information that they had researched and provided. I think it was a very empowering exercise for many of the community members. And it really shone through their dedication, really the kind of the good work that they'd done with the academic partners. It was very impressive to see.
What the findings also did was that it really created a platform for the city and the community organization to have a dialogue. And when you have a set of data that you can discuss as equals, it created a really different atmosphere and more collaborative environment. And that was really cool to see.
We're trying to understand how citizens experience the water system and how they can best adapt to the water system, whether it's droughts or flooding or service delivery, which is part of the bigger water system. And if you've got your service delivery right, then during droughts and floods, there's less impact on individual households.
This is an unusual situation because usually what happens, researchers come from institutions of higher learning and come and gather information and present that information to officials and other academics. Now it's ordinary people on the ground gathering this evidence and data on the ground in collaboration with the institution of higher learning and discipline and presenting to officials. This proves that knowledge is not only possessed by a certain sector of the society.
Do you have hope for the relationship with the city, that it could become better from here on out? Do you have any hope?
Likhona ithemba.
There is hope, yes.
Yes, there is hope.
Great. So hopefully you enjoyed that. And I think sometimes it's really important to be able to see, and actually the pictures tell so much. So just a little bit more kind of background to that process. There was this broader action learning process, that bigger green sort of section. And within that, we developed the SenseMaker project as a specific project around collecting data. And in order to do that, it was very important for us to co-design the work. I brought in some colleagues from the University of Stellenbosch who had used the SenseMaker tool before. It wasn't something I'd used before, but I'd heard them talk about it, and it seemed like a really good opportunity to develop this work. So we co-designed the work over a 4-day workshop with the caucus, EMG, and the researchers. The caucus members were then the ones who went and collected stories in their own communities. A few months later, we had another 4-day workshop where we worked with the data, analyzed it, talked about stories. The caucus members developed wonderful role plays as ways to share the information. And I'll talk a little bit more that the city officials were at that second workshop. And then there was a returning story process where we went back to the communities where we collected data, shared it with them, and then moving forward have thought about how to use this data more broadly. Just a little sense for you to get, the tool was on smartphones and printed out as questionnaires, both in English and in Afrikaans and isiXhosa for those people who wanted to do it in different languages. And essentially we're asking people to tell a story about addressing a water-related issue in their community. And we ask them to give their story a title, and they can add photos and emojis about the story. And then this methodology asks for the individual who's told the story to almost interpret their own data. So ask them to say, well, in your community, resolving water problems normally requires, and they use this triad to place their answer within the triad. So does it involve working through informal channels, bypassing the law, or working within the law? And they can place their answer where it best fits. And another one of the questions, in your community, the water situation would be improved if more responsibility was taken by local communities, local government, or other. And so this meant that the data is both qualitative and quantitative, giving a really rich sense of story and then how people are managing to resolve their issues. So just in terms of a little map, it's zoomed in of the Cape Peninsula. These areas where data was collected are where a lot of the lower income areas are. And essentially, we had over 300 stories collected. And bills and pricing were a big part of the stories that we were seeing. WMD stands for water management devices that restrict flow. Leakages were a concern for many people, toilets and sanitation, and blockages, sewage blockages. People were concerned about water restrictions, water pressure, water quality, flooding were some of the issues that were emerging. I just want to give you a sense of two of the stories that came up and show how that links to these triads. So if we look at this story that somebody shared, they titled their story Waterless. And in the story, we see that they saw their story as the effort resulting in no improvement on the left, and then they felt that they needed to bypass the law as we see their story is positioned on the right. So when my grandmother's house water was cut off, oh my word, it was horrible. There are 3 families living on the property, but their income is not that much, which means the water bill is an extremely high expense. They had to ask neighbors and family for buckets of water to survive. After struggling for many, many months, the matter was addressed. But by that time, the children were sick and the ladies in the house had infections. So as you can see from the story, they didn't explicitly say how it was addressed, but we can see that they said that they needed to bypass the law. What this often means is that they need to get in a plumber because they've asked the city to address a problem and the city doesn't come. And so then they get a plumber who bypasses the system that might not be legal, for example. And then the second story, we can see this person saw it as a temporary fix and as working through informal channels. Meter tap leak crisis. There was a leak in the outside tap, which is the main supply for the house. I phoned the municipality, but there is still no one that has come to fix the leak. I had to make do on my own by hiring a plumber to fix it. And so one of the things that really emerged from this was that often it's very challenging for people to know how to address their service delivery problem. They don't know who to call, 41%, 28% talk to somebody but get no help. Often they can't reach the right person or can't reach anybody. So 14% do talk to somebody and get help. So this story, wow to you guys. Yesterday, I woke up in the morning and found our tap's head was gone and water was flowing out. I tried to stop the water by sticking a pipe in it. I called our municipality office and reported it. They came on the same day and fixed it by replacing the old tap with a new one. And I was so happy to see that they are there for our problems and sort them out with no delays. Another person who talked to somebody but got no help said they are fed up with the council's empty promises. I have no faith in the council as my complaints fall on deaf ears. I have a blue water meter and it has not been working properly since day one. I have reported it many times and was promised that it'll be seen to. It kept leaking and my water allocation would run out quickly. So the process of collecting this data was important, and then sharing this back with the communities was really important, and role plays were a really good way to do that. But the community members also used those triads, as you can see in that bottom photo, when we went back to the different communities. What was really great is that the activists claimed ownership of the study and really saw it as theirs, which was important for them. But they are a fragile social movement, and it was really tricky at times, and many issues came up and many challenges that we've actually spent quite a lot of time documenting as sort of lessons learned. But what was really hard was using this data to inform practice. The city actors, there was one person from the water department at the first workshop, and then at the second workshop, one of the days, 5 of the senior officials came, and they were really excited about the data. We sat in these working groups in this photo you can see and explored with different city department members how we might share this further, where we might be able to use this data. And there were a lot of good ideas that came out. There was a date set for a meeting, which was unfortunately just before lockdown. And actually next week, they're going to meet in person for the first time. So there's been a big gap in this process, but also trying to understand within the city of Cape Town where this data might sit, how it might be integrated is very hard because of the way the city's water data is set up, which is not to include community input at all much. And so this picture just questions in terms of the mismatches between what it means to live in a low income settlement in Cape Town and a high income settlement or middle income settlement in Cape Town. So yes, emerging from the drought, there's successful water management, but who's experiencing this and in what areas is it seen as successful? And so one of the papers that we've written building on the sense maker is really about building capacity for climate adaptation and making climate adaptation transformative. And so the part that I really want to get across in this slide is just how important the knowledge creation side is and how important it is to focus on those knowledges that we see at the bottom, the knowledge holders who have local knowledge, lived experience, and traditional knowledge. If we can pull together these different kinds of knowledges, then when we think about developing adaptation responses to reduce climate risk, we don't just have incremental adaptation that just reduces climate risk. We have more transformative adaptation that is context specific, can help with empowering communities, is more representative and legitimate, and can work towards building ecological and social sustainability. So there were a lot of challenges and opportunities for developing community-generated data. And this process of transdisciplinary knowledge creation really had reciprocal learning. Us as academics learned so much, there was activist empowerment and helped to diversify the knowledge sources. But what we see is it's really hard to use data to inform change. And I think that us as researchers realize that it's very hard for us as people who work in the field of research and data, even to use it to inform policy and practice. And so we've worked with the people from the caucus, and one of the things was to make movies. So that little movie is part of what came out of their request. We're working with another great group who maps water stories, so that's another way to share the data as well. But in conclusion, I think it's really challenging to integrate community generated into city government systems because of the way they're set up currently. I've done previous work interviewing city officials who talked about the need for the data to be verifiable if it's going to be on their system. What does that mean to them? How do you cross-check it? How do you integrate it into a current system that's not set up for that? It's challenging for activists and citizens to collect and analyze data when they don't have the skills for it. And often they're not easy ways to engage with the formal governance system and share this data. I think there's some really exciting stories coming out of Slum Dwellers International, and some of you might have heard of the work from SDI. They've worked a lot with community mobilization, data generation. They've got an amazing program called Know Your City, where people in cities are reporting data and trying to work with local governments to share that data, because the reality is often local government officials battle to get data in low-income areas. And so it's really important that we can develop this mix. So in conclusion, just to kind of stress the importance of community-generated data for resilience, but we really need a lot more effort and work, and every context is different. And of course, the issues here in Seattle or in Sierra Leone are very different, but we need to constantly, I think, be questioning this and how we can make sure that these different perspectives have more attention in the work that we're doing. Thank you very much. There are 2 papers written up on the SenseMaker process and a sort of briefing note to go with that for those who are interested. Thank you all. I'll stop share now and we can hopefully have some questions in the last bit.
Thank you, Gina. That was really fantastic. Peter, do you want to kick off? Or?
Yeah, so just as a reminder to the attendees, if you do have questions, to enter it into the Q&A, and then we'll ask those questions to Gina as they come along.
And while we're waiting for questions, I have an initial question that you've touched on a little bit, but as somebody who was thinking about how to engage in these kind of co-production efforts and have not, I see my own work as doing this to a certain extent, because it involves collecting more ethnographic type information and working with communities to help develop questionnaires and things like that together. Not quite as formulaic as SenseMaker, but in the same spirit. But there's a big issue about response burden in terms of these are the people that often are heard from least have the least resources and capacity to participate in these kinds of efforts. Can you comment on that and give us some insights into how you've dealt with that?
Sure. I think that's really important. And I think what was very important for me in this experience was that the caucus members, and they really wanted to do this, and they wanted to develop their own capacity to do this because they felt that this could be an advocacy tool. And so they've been working in the space for years and could see that other groups had data and what they saw as evidence, and they didn't have that. So they wanted to do that. They wanted to develop their research skills, and it was really hard. I mean, you know, we spend years training our students to do this. So we could see that that was challenging. But there was such a sense of empowerment from them around when they were able to go and ask a story from somebody and sit there and listen. And so they felt engaged in their community doing it as well. But I think your point is so important because, yeah, as part of this broader program, you know, one of the women really had threats to her because she was asking about these issues. And how do you deal with that? Another issue is that, so as part of the project, we were able to provide some resources for data and collecting time, but then because of the politics of community organizations, that also created conflict for people who weren't involved in this process. So for me, the most important thing is talking about it a lot and having these conversations to say, well, what's going to work for you? How does this work so that it isn't a burden, but it's something that you want to do? Otherwise, us as academics or researchers need to take responsibility and pay enumerators to collect data where necessary. So I think it is something that is tricky.
You raise a question I'd love to follow up on, which is this issue of providing resources or helping to support the time and effort that it takes, and to all parties involved. And just looking at this from a federal grant perspective, it's difficult to even know how to handle the bureaucratic requirements and administrative requirements on even giving out simple stipends, for example. Did you run into problems like that? And do you have any suggestions for people dealing with these kinds of issues?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, so first of all, my funder was very flexible. So they were very open to how I was using the money and was happy for me to do that. But I'm at a university, and running this through a university would have been really challenging. So what I did is worked with the NGO, and so gave the NGO grant so that they could work with the caucus where they had some relationships, they had more flexibility, because otherwise, it would have been an absolute headache for me to try and deal with the kind of day-to-day admin of transport and meals and exactly. So having an intermediary organization that can do that and does it well was quite important.
And one last follow-up, and then we have another question here. So there is this question about you mentioned that the NGOs were fragile in some sense, fragile social movements, and there is this question of sort of who do NGOs represent? In risk communication, it's been suggested by Adam Corner and colleagues that you shouldn't represent activists and protesters in images because they alienate so many people who don't identify with them. How do you think about representation and representativeness of the NGOs with whom you engaged?
Yeah, could you maybe frame that a different way?
Well, do you worry about people being left out because they don't identify with the NGOs you used as that you were relying on as intermediaries for these communities?
So no, in the Cape Town context, in the sense that we have thousands of people who are really battling to access water services. And so there is just, I think, most people in these low-income areas feel that they are not heard, they are not seen, and that their water issues are not being met. So when we presented this back to people in the communities, these different sort of suburbs where we'd worked, some of those people had told their stories, others hadn't, and they were very interested and excited about the data because it is just an area that has not received enough attention. So in this specific context, I don't think that was an issue and also because of the range of stories, people could see their different stories identified there. So in this case, I don't think that was an issue.
Great. And that maybe leads into this question that we've received here, which is, Beth Eichelt asks, what would your process of community engagement work for social issues like community policing and crime?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think what's important for me is that this really was a kind of co-produced process. And so it was tricky. It's not the normal kind of academic work. It wasn't like, this is the methodology, this is how we're doing it. It was really co-produced. So in those 4 days of workshops, just trying to come up with the questions we'd ask, it was, well, what was important to the caucus members? Which were the questions to be asked? And then us as academics also going, well, actually, it's quite important to balance it with this work. And so absolutely, this is exactly the kind of work that we need around community policing and crime. But how do you collaborate? And a lot of it is about trust. And in the sort of one paper that we drew on when we were writing that, it talked a lot about how in this transdisciplinary process, at certain times, it makes more sense for the kind of academics to have a little bit more controls, maybe the wrong word, but say of like, well, this is what a good research process is. And then to hand over to the community partners who know the community, who know how to enter it, who know how to engage. Then as you get the data back, the academics know how to analyze it and can help pull that together. And then again, it's back to the community group who needs to kind of take leadership on taking that forward with support from academics who know how to do it. So it is a bit of a dance and it requires a lot of engagement and time and effort. But I really think that we need more of these kinds of processes, because this is where we really get deep work done and empower the communities themselves who want to take this stuff forward.
Maybe to follow up on that, if someone were to want to engage in this in the context of policing, how would they go about finding, and I presume they would probably know who the NGOs were, but do you have any suggestions for understanding and getting to know the NGO landscape for specific issues?
So, I mean, yeah, I think that's really important. And I can't give it for other areas exactly. You need to be looking at the NGOs in your area. And what I'd say is also interesting is I've worked a lot on urban climate issues, and I worked a lot on flooding. And what was interesting is I kind of looked for NGOs working on flooding and there weren't any. And then I started to understand that it was actually people working on housing, on land issues, etc., that were very concerned about flooding. And so I started working with those NGOs and understanding that they were actually doing the relevant work. So you do need to do your homework and engage with local organizations and understand them. And I think one of the things I've learned a lot as an academic working in South Africa is that many of these NGOs are quite cautious of working with academics. Academics have been extractive. The NGOs kind of spend time and effort trying to answer your questions for what? And so it is a relationship you need to develop so that there's trust, and that, I mean, I always make sure my students do like a briefing note or ask what other products go with it. And sometimes they'd much prefer a 3-minute movie than an academic thesis, which really nobody in that NGO is going to read, to be honest.
So we're going to have a question from Mary, who's going to ask it live instead of having us read the question.
Hello. This was super interesting, but so I was just curious. So I don't know if you're familiar with, there's like sort of like community engagement apps that are used in sort of like the urban planning space, like Co-Urbanize and Citizen Lab. And I was curious what you thought about like using tools, pre-existing tools like that for research, just because I feel like in research, a lot of times we use something like RedCap, or we make a custom way to collect data from community members. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I don't know those tools, so I'm interested to, yeah, maybe you could even say a bit more about them. And for me, I don't think there's a problem with using an existing tool. If the tool is capturing what you need, if it's ready-made. I mean, it takes a lot of effort to customize these tools or develop your own. And so it's more, what is the question that you're trying to answer, and how is that helpful? And how is that data being shared with the people who want to use it? Is it relevant to them? How can they use it? And I mean, what I've seen is that actually giving support to these organizations to think through how they can use data, how they try and share their data is actually really important, because that's often hard work. And for example, this NGO wouldn't have had the resources to develop a film or to kind of get their stories mapped in the way that we're doing in this other mapping project. And so collaborating and supporting is important. And I think more and more as academics, we also need to reflect on these quite honestly, talk about the challenges, the opportunities, and share that, because yeah, we need to learn lessons from each other.
Thank you.
We have another question here from Larissa. Larissa, do you want to ask your question live? Peter, I don't know how to do this, so I'm going to, here we go.
Sure, yeah, it worked. Thank you so much, Gina, for your presentation. I loved it. I also lived in South Africa for years, so it's so nice to hear about what you're talking about. And I was wondering, what is your advice for initiating a community-generated data project? Like proposing the idea to the community that they generate their own data, if they could be worried about recrimination. And I specifically work in like migration issues, so different from what you're doing, and more like politically maybe vulnerable.
Great question. And so I think that's where we have to build these relationships. And also as an academic, you can help them think through it. There are people at the university who have worked on ethics, who've worked on confidentiality. Can you bring that in? And why do they want to collect the data? I'm trying to help them understand why it would be useful for them is important. I think, that's one thing I've learned as well. It takes a lot of time and effort to collect data. And if you don't have a good plan for it, you don't want to just collect it for the sake of it. So where's it going? How do you develop it? And working with them to understand those issues, I think, is really important. But actually, often to fight some of these injustices, we need to have the evidence. We need to be building and sharing these stories. And just to come back to the point earlier where I talked about the drought, where I've worked with a journalist, I find often it is useful to work with journalists if you know and trust them. I think, all of us have probably had experiences where journalists have taken what we've said out of context. But I've worked with a science journalist for many years in different ways, and I trust her and we work closely together and I check it. So, getting the challenges that people are facing heard more broadly is really important. And we can do some of that through an academic channel. We can do some of it as kind of activist academics. And then sometimes we need to pass it on to others to share that more broadly.
Thank you, Gina. I have another follow-on question here that I'd like to follow up with, which I think goes directly to the issue of vulnerable communities. You mentioned that the issue of informal settlements and trying to reach people in informal settlements particularly. I didn't catch how much of the data collection that was done by the caucus was done in informal settlements versus other types of communities, and I was wondering about that. And wondering about the even more challenging issues of understanding these issues in informal settlements, where there is probably a wide variety of infrastructure or lack of infrastructure, and even more diverse issues.
Great, yeah. So the majority of the stories were probably from low-income settlements where there are built houses, but very simple, what we call RDP, reconstruction and development, very simple, sort of maybe 2 rooms, but a built house. But what we've seen happen in Cape Town is something called backyard dwellers. So you have a formal house, and then in the backyard, there are people living in shacks, because the owner of that house then rents out space to people for them to get an income, and because there's such limited space. So you've got quite a mix of residents. And so the people in those shacks don't have running water. They'll need to go and use the tap at the house. And it's been very interesting in Cape Town seeing this move from where informal settlements, and by informal settlements, I mean they're sort of shacks, there are standpipes and taps that the city provides. and there are sometimes toilets or portable toilets. And the city of Cape Town is really trying to move towards seeing informal settlements a part of the city. So 10, 20 years ago, it was kind of like informal settlements aren't ours to deal with. Now cities are seeing that they need to deal with informal settlements. This is where people are living, but it's often very hard. That land is often private land, and then the city battles to provide services. And so, you know, even those stories I shared about, well, nobody came to fix the tap, because if the tap is on your property, you're responsible for it. And so nobody from the local government is supposed to fix your tap because it's your property. The other person who had a tap fixed, it was possibly a communal tap, and that is the government's responsibility. So if they log that call, you know, within a day, the government might come and address that problem. So it's just very complex often to manage, and there are a lot of surge issues as well. And, you know, there's a lot of lack of clarity of whose role and responsibility is that. But one of the things I just wanted to add is that, you know, some interesting interview I did a few years ago was the city of Cape Town had this data on how many toilets were in a certain area. And they said, okay, we've got data, there are enough toilets for the settlement. When an NGO started working there, they were like, no, there is political infighting in the settlement. So these houses can use that toilet. So they've got enough because actually there are 10 toilets for these 10 houses, but they're not letting any of those other people come here. So there might be 50 houses trying to use those 5 toilets. So of course it's not enough. So that's part of where I'm coming from when I'm saying we really need to understand this data. There might be taps in these areas, but are they working or aren't they? And so that's the nuance of trying to address these issues for those people who are living in these poor conditions, and how can we really meet these needs, and how can cities kind of understand better what's happening at these local levels.
Right. Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Anne. So join us next week for our final event of the quarter, which is our lightning talk and poster sessions, which should be a very exciting end of the quarter event. So thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Peter.